Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, hi, my name is Monica. I like to post anti-MLM life and some true crime content here on this channel. So if any of that interests you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. I would love for you to stick around. Make sure to also like this video. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about the case of John Meehan, also known as Dirty John. If you have not watched, there is a Bravo series as well that came out. And there's also a podcast dedicated to this entire case. It's a really, really great podcast. I highly recommend, if you want more details about the case, to listen to that podcast, because this video is just going to be I guess you can say just like a brief overview of the case, of what happened and everything of that nature. So of course, just as a disclaimer, this video is for, I guess you can say, educational purposes. It's some opinion-based things, and as well as that, this is intended for mature audiences, and it contains graphic descriptions of crime scenes, adult dialogue, and adult language, so viewer discretion is advised. Hey guys, Editing Monica here. I also wanted to add to this that this is just based on the research that I did, and I do always encourage you guys to do your own research, just because maybe there's something I missed. There are a lot more details to this particular case that I chose to leave out. There's just a ton of other things that happened throughout this whole entire thing, but this is just a brief overview. If I were to talk about all of the details, this video would probably be way over an hour long. It's already an hour long. So that's why I just wanted to come on here and say that, of course, just do your own research as per usual, because I could have missed something. So anyway, let's get back to the video. There are a few things that I wanted to say before we get into the story behind Debra and John, and before we get into the whole entire case. I did just want to say, please go into this with an open mind, because a lot of people, even in the year 2020, they like to victim blame, and I do not want anyone passing any kind of judgment. And you'll understand why as I go into this case. And on top of that as well, the older daughter, she's not the oldest daughter of Debra, but the older daughter she does have a character in the show Dirty John, or the series. I do want to say that because she has chosen to be kept anonymous, I won't be using her real name. I'll be using her character's name in the show. So if you hear me saying Veronica or Ronnie, that is the daughter. And just like I said, because I want to respect her wishes of wanting to be able to be kept anonymous in this whole entire situation, and she has wanted to stay out of the limelight. So I do just want to, like I said, out of respect, keep her name out of this. But she does play a really big role in this case. So of course we will be talking about her, but we're going to be using a different name. I am going to go over just a little bit about Debra, because this isn't really about her background or anything like that, because in my personal opinion, I think that she's a very inspirational and very successful woman. But in order to understand John Meehan, and in order to understand how Debra and John's relationship got to the point that it got to, we have to talk about his background, because all of this started for him at a very young age. So first we're going to talk about Debra. Debra is, just like I said, a very inspirational and a very successful woman. She was super fancy, and if you look at any of her photos, she, honestly, to me, she reminds me of the, not stereotypical, but I guess you can kind of say the stereotypical woman in California who really truly takes care of her appearance and is also very well off. So of course she was an easy target for John, because as you'll find out later, he's a con artist. In March of 1984, sadly, she lost her sister. She had a sister named Cindy, and Cindy had been in a relationship with her husband Billy for approximately 13 years. At the time, her and Billy were going through a divorce. The marriage wasn't working anymore. And Billy ended up shooting her sister in the head. And her sister died. When they came to the scene, she was already passed away. But Billy ended up shooting himself in the stomach at the same time, And the shot wound to his stomach didn't kill him. He actually survived. And what ended up happening after this was Billy would be arrested. He would be brought to court. He would have a trial. And at Billy's trial, Cindy and Debra's mom, Elaine, she testified in Billy's defense. It was a very weird situation. A lot of people were wondering what kind of a family dynamic do they have, that this woman just lost her daughter, but she's testifying in the defense of her daughter's killer. She talked about how he was a great person, how she loved him so much, and how she forgives him. She also would go on to say that she thought he was just not in the right mind, that it was kind of like, I guess you can say kind of like a crime of passion, because he couldn't let Cindy go. As I was saying, Cindy was almost painted in not necessarily a negative way, but it almost seemed as though Arlene was more so on Billy's side in this whole entire case. He pled guilty in exchange for a 5-year sentence. They gave him a lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter instead of murder. And he was released in 1986, serving less than 3 years in prison. Talk about getting off easy. That just, to me, is absolutely insane. I've seen this in multiple cases that I've looked into, but I mean, I think that he should have at least served his full sentence, and I think getting a 5-year sentence was really, really, really low. But because of this whole situation, Debra had a fear of firearms. She didn't want them anywhere near her. She didn't want them in her home. She was terrified of them, rightfully so. I would honestly, if I was in that situation and if I knew all of this had happened to my sister, I'm not gonna lie, I would probably be terrified of them as well. And with that also being said, a lot of her friends would say that maybe she needed some kind of protection because Debra did live on her own. She was single, and it was very, very obvious that this woman was very well off. She always wore designer items from Gucci, Chanel, all of that kind of stuff. So it was obvious that she had money. And a lot of her friends and family were worried that someone's going to try to rob her or try to hurt her to get her money or to get certain items that she had. She was even known to have a safe in her apartment that had all of her designer items in it, which included, just like I said, the Gucci, the Chanel, her Birkin bags. And so obviously she was very, very careful with her items. Because we're on the topic of Debra and how she was a successful woman, she was not handed that success. She worked very hard for that success. She was in the interior design business for about 30 years before she started her own firm, which was called Ambrosia. She would end up having 4 kids of her own, and she was married and divorced 4 times as well. So this was a point in time where Debra just wanted to find someone. She was in her 50s, and she thought that she's so successful, and now she wants to be able to share that life with someone. She would take her clients on tours of their homes, and Debra would use this, I guess you can kind of say this tactic of having her clients envision themselves in the home and envision themselves in this dream of theirs. That's how she was able to be good at her job. She was very good at her job. And of course, she would end up meeting John. But before we talk about how she met John, let's go over John a little bit, because his background is just really shady and really sketchy. John was raised by his sisters. And what would end up happening was he kind of took after his dad. His dad was very known to be a con artist. He was always into things like insurance, not necessarily insurance fraud, but he was trying to get insurance money, insurance scams. We'll just call it insurance scams. There were times where John would jump in front of a moving car in order to be able to get money from the insurance company. There were times where he went into a restaurant with his dad and they would put glass in his food and make it look like this happened at the restaurant, that this wasn't them, it was just foul play from the restaurant. So this was just an ongoing thing that was constantly happening, and John would also end up going into the drug scene. He was not only using, but he was also selling. And this was at a very young age. So, of course, because he grew up in this dynamic and because he grew up in this shady atmosphere, he just turned into his dad. If you have seen the show, or if you've listened to the Dirty John podcast, it's obviously about Debra Newell and John Meehan and what happened in their relationship and what ended up happening at the end. But John was given the name Dirty John, or also known as Filthy John, because of when he was at the University of Dayton in Ohio. His classmates would say that he got this nickname because he would always brag about how he was able to get all of the girls, what he was able to do with all of these women, and just how shady of a person that he was as well. In November of 1990, he would meet his first wife. Her name was Tanya Sells, and she was a nurse. They would end up getting married. She was 25 and John was 31 at the time. However, he had told Tanya that he was 26 at the time. They would be living in Ohio. John wouldn't let his family come to their wedding. He would always make up excuses for everything, but he would go on to say that his family, they're just a bunch of addicts, they're just a bunch of losers, if you want to say that, is what his mind was thinking about, and how he thought they would just ruin the wedding, so he didn't want anybody from his family at their wedding. And John and Tanya would end up having 2 daughters. And Tanya would put John through nursing school because that's what he wanted to do. And then between the months of July to September in the year 2000, Tanya would start to find out some more information about John. John was very, very adamant on Tanya never talking to John's mom, that she's to have no communication with her, that he forbids it, he was basically just saying, you're not allowed to talk to my mom. Well, Tanya decides to track down John's mom, and her name is Dolores. And Dolores had told Tanya that, first of all, his name was John. He told Tanya that his name was Jonathan. He also lied about his birthday, and she ended up telling Tanya about John's drug charge in California. After this phone call, Tanya decided to search the home to see if, in fact, John was lying to her, especially because at this point in time, she had already grown some kind of suspicion about John, because all of a sudden, he started acting very not like himself. He was acting very strange. His behavior had completely changed from the John that she had married. And because she found out that he had a drug charge, she thought maybe he's using, and maybe he's going down this spiral. She would end up finding a bunch of hidden surgical anesthetic drugs in their home. And she knew that John was not supposed to be taking these drugs out of the hospital, that it wasn't permitted for him to take them out. And he should have been giving these to his patients. What Tanya would end up doing is she would call the police, and she would notify them of everything that she found in September of the year 2000. Because of this, there was an investigation started about John and everything that was happening. In January of 2002, there was yet another investigation that was opened about John. This was because an investigator for the Warren County Sheriff's Department in Ohio, they were notified that some other hospital workers, the hospital that John was working at, they noticed that he had brought a gun into the operating room, along with stealing some other drugs from the hospital that he should have been giving to a patient, but instead he was giving the patient saline, and he was taking the drugs that he was supposed to be giving to these patients. In April of 2002, as a result of the investigation that was undergoing about the the gun that the hospital employee saw, along with the drugs and everything of that nature, he would be stripped of his nursing license. And police did in fact end up finding a gun. They also found 45 empty containers for 6 different prescription medications. After they had found all of this in June of 2002, John pled guilty to felony of drug theft. On top of that as well, instead of just surrendering to the police and going through with the trial and, doing the right thing, he decided that he was not going to go through with this, and he fled and would check himself into a hotel in Michigan. When police finally found him, they found him unconscious, and he was surrounded by drugs and different bottles, vials, that kind of a thing. It was all just kind of scattered around. Well, they called an ambulance as soon as possible because he was unconscious. When they finally brought him back and when they had him in the ambulance, John decided he was going to flee yet again. What he ended up doing was grabbing the drug kit. He jumped out of this ambulance, and the guy took off running into a local JCPenney. He would end up going into the elevator shaft of the JCPenney. The police officers would be following him as well and running after him. When he got into this elevator shaft, he had kicked the one officer in the face, so he thought he had gotten out. Well, the police officers finally caught up to him, and they finally got him. He ended up stumbling and falling and knocking himself unconscious. So he, karma. But when he went and he was arrested for this, he was sentenced up to 6 years in prison in the state of Michigan for resisting arrest and possession of drugs. He only served 17 months and was released in 2004. In February of 2014, John would continue to be terrorizing other women. He pled guilty to stalking a woman in Laguna Beach that he met in a hospital that was recovering from brain surgery. She would eventually become very uncomfortable with the fact that John was very, very just adamant on giving the suggestion of her moving her money from her bank account into John's bank account, and so that she could hide it from her estranged husband, which is obviously very suspicious. This woman would end up ending the relationship with John, and what he would end up doing is pursuing her family, sending them threatening messages, and also sending them intimate photos of this woman to her family, which is just horrible and just disgusting. With all of this that happened, let's get into how John and Debra met in October of 2014. On October 8th of 2014, John was released from prison for serving time for violating a restraining order. And 2 days later, on October 10th, he decided to meet up with Debra. He had found her on an over 50s dating site. So this is the part where I'm going to tell everyone that is online dating, please be careful with who you go on dates with. And please, if you see warning signs or red flags, please be careful. Always let your friends and family know where you are at all times when meeting, when going, because this is basically a blind date that they went on. I mean, they saw each other's photos on the dating site, but the reason why Debra didn't have good luck with this app previously is because a lot of the guys that she met on the app, they didn't look like their photos. They looked worse than their photos. They were not the right guy. They didn't seem like how they did online. So please, 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 always be safe and be careful. But anyway, let's keep going. So the two of them would end up meeting in a restaurant in, I believe it was Irvine, California. And John would start his con artist ways. He would tell her that he was a doctor and that he served in Iraq as an anesthesiologist, along with spending a year with the Doctors Without Borders. So, of course, Debra thought this was really impressive. But the thing about John that Debra liked so much about him is that even though he told her this, most of the conversation was John talking about Debra and asking Debra questions about herself, asking her questions that no other guy would ask her on dates, because a lot of times when she would go on dates, these guys would be very full of themselves. They would talk about themselves the entire time. They had no care in the world about Debra, and all of a sudden there's this guy who's really truly interested in Debra, and already after just this one date, he's just worshiping her, and he put her on this pedestal, and she hadn't had that before. So she was very interested in John because of this. And that very same night, the one thing that Debra said about that night is she noticed that he was really touchy-feely, but she didn't really mind it. She kind of liked the attention that she was getting from John. And they would end up going back to her apartment because she felt safe with him. So when they went back to her apartment, John got a little too touchy-feely. He was kind of forcing himself on her. He laid in her bed at one point, and she didn't feel comfortable with this. She would end up telling him that she's not one of those types of girls who puts out on the first date. And John got really upset about this. He ended up saying a few things to Debra, but he did end up leaving when she asked him to leave. Debra would go on to talk about her date and think that this guy's just like all the other ones that are just looking for some random one-night stand or are just looking for someone to hook up with, that they're not really truly looking for someone to get involved with. And so she honestly thought that he was just a jerk, that he was just an outright jerk. Well, the next day, John would constantly call her, text her, let her know that he's so sorry, he apologizes, he just got a little too drunk, and that she hopes that they can go out on another date and that he can prove to her that he's not this, I guess you can say. Debra decided, you know what? I'll give him a second chance. So that's exactly what she did. She gave John a second chance. Debra would go on to say that the relationship was moving very quickly, but she didn't really seem to mind. And the thing that John was very good at was love bombing. If you're one of my anti-MLM subscribers, you already know how in MLM companies they do this all the time. They love bomb. They make you feel good. They tell you the things that you want to hear. And it's just a way to scam. That's the best way to put it. But what Debra found a little strange was the fact that John was always in his scrubs. And the reason why she thought it was so strange was because he would show up everywhere in his scrubs, even to formal events. So there was this event, and it was supposed to be this very fancy formal event. What ended up happening was, of course, John shows up in his scrubs. And Debra kind of questioned it and was a little taken aback by it because it was just odd. It was odd behavior. Why would you show up to this formal event in your scrubs? I understand that you're a doctor, according to John, but why? And of course, John Meehan had an explanation for everything. He told her he didn't have enough time to change on his way over, which, let's be real here, you would have had enough time. He did show up late, but what he ended up telling Debra was, just tell your friends I'm a doctor. You're going to be able to impress your friends and show me off to your friends. So she said, you know what? You're right. Why am I judging you for coming in your scrubs? But anyway, her daughters were very suspicious of John. They thought it was very odd that he was always in his scrubs. And why is he always in his scrubs? And why does he dress the way that he does? Her one older daughter, she's not the oldest daughter, but Veronica, or Ronnie, she would go on to say that he looked like a homeless person, that he just looked like what the cat dragged off the street kind of a deal. And in the Dirty John podcast, Debra's daughter, Veronica, would go on to say that, I told my mom she'd better get this creep out of the house or I don't plan on living with her. Now, mind you, at the time, Debra Newell was living in a very, very nice penthouse. Well, her daughter, Veronica, would end up leaving and she would move out. Debra's younger daughter, Tara, who is if you know this story, you know about Tara. She was also uncomfortable with John, but the difference with her is she wasn't as vocal as Veronica was. Veronica was very, very well known in speaking her mind and speaking her opinion. She was just trying to protect her mom. This isn't the first time she's talked about Debra's exes before. She didn't like the other ones, and she doesn't like this one. So it's nothing new. But Tara also felt uncomfortable. However, she didn't say anything in the beginning because she was known to be the quiet daughter. She was known to be the one that didn't really speak out, and she didn't really intervene in these kinds of things. But it gets worse. In November of 2014, just 1 month after they met, they ended up moving in together in a house in Balboa Island in Newport Beach. So this house would obviously be in Debra's name. Everything would be in her name. She would end up paying for it. And the reason why John didn't want his name on the lease, or he didn't want to have his name anywhere on this, was because of the fact that he was having tax problems. So there's that. However, he treated Debra so well that Debra didn't think anything of it. She had thought that she finally met the guy of her dreams. He was so nice to her. He treated her really well. He would even hold her purse in public. And so she thought that she finally had this really amazing guy in her life. Well, there was obviously tension between John and Debra's daughters. And there was a point in time where Tara came into town with her boyfriend. This was right before Thanksgiving. And they had pulled up as they were moving in. So at this point in time, though, Tara didn't know that they were living together. She thought that John was just helping her mom move in. And you could tell at the time that he was trying to be this big, bad, tough guy, and he was trying to get all of this stuff into the house without anybody's help because he's this macho guy. But when Tara introduced herself and when she talked to John, he was very cold towards her. He was very standoffish and didn't want to talk to her. But Tara thought maybe, just maybe, I caught him at a bad time, or maybe it's because he had such a bad experience with my sister that maybe it's just one of those things where he just has to open up to me. So she decided, I'll give him another chance. It's not a big deal. After this situation happened, they all got into the house, and Tara noticed that John's stuff was scattered all over the place, and she was curious as to why his stuff was there, especially if the mom didn't say anything about them moving in together. So she started snooping around a little bit, and she found some of John's things. She found that he had a nursing certificate and that he wasn't a doctor, he was a nurse. So he had been lying to Debra about this. When Tara brought this up to Debra, Debra was kind of shocked a little bit, but then John intervened. And he, at the time, didn't know that Tara had snooped around. He thought that they just stumbled upon it. And so he was saying, oh, well, the reason why I call myself a doctor is because I have a PhD. So I'm able to call myself a doctor. But yes, you're right. I'm a nurse and this and that. But when he found out that Tara was the one that found it and that she was snooping around, he flipped out. He got very angry very quickly. He was yelling at Tara. He was telling Debra that if this were his kids, he would have smacked them right away, and that her kids are spoiled. They're little spoiled brats. How dare they go through his things? And the whole time that this bit of rage from John was happening, Debra didn't say anything. She didn't intervene. And because of this, Tara had questioned her mom, and she said, are you just gonna let this guy talk to me this way? And she didn't say anything. So Tara and her boyfriend ended up leaving the home, and they ended up not wanting to be in there anymore. They weren't okay with staying there. Then it was time for Thanksgiving. This is when Arlene, who is Debra's mom, would end up meeting John for the first time. John was on his dating profile online. He had said that he was a Christian, which is something that Debra was looking for. It was very important for her to be able to go to church and be able to bring him to church with her because her mom was an avid churchgoer. So she brings John to Thanksgiving dinner, and Arlene gets to meet him for the first time. Arlene said that she loved him. He was great. He was just an all-around really great guy. So, of course, everybody else had an issue with John at the time, except for Arlene. At one point, John had approached Debra's one daughter, Veronica, and had told her that he wanted to talk to her on the side. She flipped out and she made a scene and she said, "Whatever you have to say to me, you can say in front of everybody else. I don't want anything to do with you. I think that you're evil. I want nothing to do with you." Because of course she heard about what happened with Tara as well. And because of this incident, Debra would end up kind of starting to believe John a little bit, because he would start saying things like, "Your kids just want your inheritance. They don't really care about you. They're trying to split us up. How dare they try to split us up? You're happy, I'm happy. Why can't they see that?" The typical BS. And what Debra would do is she would go see a therapist. She would tell her therapist about this incident, and because the therapist didn't really know much about John, she did the stereotypical, you need to set boundaries with your kids, and you need to let them know that this is your life, not theirs, blah, blah, blah. So after that, Debra, of course, was still seeing John, and she didn't like his wardrobe because it was very dirty. It was very just jeans and a t-shirt kind of a deal. It wasn't I guess you can say it wasn't up to her standards, because she was really, really fancy. She was very, very big on her appearance and taking care of herself. And which, I mean, if you have the money to do that, then yeah, of course, I would dress the same way if I had that kind of money. But so she ended up taking John to get a whole new wardrobe. She finally decided she's going to buy him a bunch of new clothes so that he could match her lifestyle. She already really, really enjoyed being around this man. They lived together, but now she wanted him to kind of look the part, I guess you can say. And then in December of 2014, just 2 months after they had met, you guessed it, John and Debra would get married. The way that they got married was Debra was going on a work trip in Las Vegas, and John decided to tag along with her. But they ended up getting married at a courthouse, and no guests were invited. They didn't want anybody to be there, and Debra would end up keeping this a secret from her kids. And that's kind of where I feel like if you feel the need to hide your marriage from your children, there's a problem. But I feel as though if your kids are really that concerned, maybe you should sit down and talk to them about it. And maybe you should see where they're coming from. Maybe you should look into this guy that you're dating. Of course, by this point, he had already brainwashed her. In my personal opinion, I think that he had already brainwashed her at this point. Now, fast forward to Christmas of 2014. They were going to Debra's oldest daughter's home, not the one that I talked about before that had a situation with John, but her oldest daughter's home. And her other daughter, Tara, the younger one, she went to therapy with Debra a number of times, and they were trying to work through their differences because obviously Tara was upset, rightfully so. She was upset about what her mother had let this guy do to her. And Tara had said in that therapy session that she didn't want John around the kids, that she didn't want to see him. Well, during Christmas, John bought the children a bunch of different toys, and he brought all of them to Christmas. Tara had gotten so upset that she left the room and started crying. Arlene, Debra's mother and Tara's grandmother, followed her and talked to her about it and just kind of tried to, I guess, make the situation better. But Tara and Veronica already had their own opinion of John. So after Christmas, Tara and her boyfriend would end up going back to Vegas. The older daughter, not the oldest, but Veronica, she decided that she was gonna maybe start looking into this guy a little bit, but she started noticing more red flags pop up. She would notice that she would get contacted by her mother via text message, but the way that the text messages were not the way that her mom texts. A lot of the words were misspelled, or they weren't. It's as if someone else was texting for her. So of course she started suspecting that John was texting her from her mother's phone. Because Debra had she had a Tesla, she also had a Jaguar, and she also had, I believe, a Range Rover. And this Tesla was a car that John was always taking. He was constantly using the Tesla. He was using it to run errands. He was using it to go to work. And Veronica decided that she wants to put a tracking device on the car. She's curious as to where John goes during the day. And when they brought up all of this tracking information, they noticed that it wasn't really too much out of the ordinary. The only weird part was that he was constantly going to this warehouse, but there was a bunch of doctor's offices on the stop on his, the time in the car. And there was also a lot of times where he would stop for food and stuff like that. So it wasn't really anything out of the ordinary. Now, this is where it gets a little scary. John and Debra, they started going to church together a lot. So every single Sunday they would go to church. And the one Sunday that they came back home, they ended up seeing this woman that was just sitting in their living room. And it was weird because her hair was wet. She was in Debra's clothes, specifically her white clothing, which was really weird. And she was holding a Bible. So Debra had thought maybe this was a homeless person, or maybe this was just a drug addict that just stumbled upon into their home. And John ended up intervening, and he got Debra to go outside and to call 911 while he took care of this woman, which he ended up smashing her head in the counter and also putting her hands behind her back. But there was talk by investigators saying that he had planned it, that that was someone that he knew, and that it was just really suspicious because right after that, John had told Debra that we need to up the security. We need to up the surveillance. We're going to get a bunch of security cameras in the house. We're going to get a bunch of security cameras at your office, and I'm going to be able to watch from my phone, and I'll be able to have control over the cameras from my phone, so I'm able to see everything at all times. There was one day where Debra had noticed that John was taking some kind of pills and he was injecting himself with something. So she questioned it, which rightfully so. If you're married to someone and you see them taking medication and they're injecting themselves with something, you kind of want to know what they're doing, because you never know. They might have some kind of ailment that you should know about. But in his case, he said that while he was in Iraq, he injured his back. So that's why he was taking Oxy for it. And that he had some kind of kidney issues and he was injecting himself with testosterone. So that's a little weird, if you ask me, that he didn't bother to tell her about this before they got married. I mean, that's a little odd because she just walks in on him injecting himself with something. But anyway, I digress. In March of 2015, is when Debra ends up finding out a little bit more about John. But before we get into all of what she found out, let's talk about what happened in February of 2015, because there were some weird instances between her nephew and the kids and John and that kind of a thing. So let's go over that first. So there was a conversation in February of 2015 where her nephew, Shad, who was Cindy's son. If you don't remember Cindy from the beginning of the story, that is Debra's sister who passed away and, was murdered. And her son was named Shad. So Debra had thought of Shad as not just a nephew, but as her son. He was always in her life and she had a very strong connection to him. And he had come over and he was interacting with John and Debra. And John had made this very weird joke. In my opinion, it's not even a joke, but I think it's more of a threat. But John had said that he could take out Veronica within 1,000 yards, that he could definitely do it. And instead of anyone saying anything, Debra laughed about it. She didn't really say anything about it because I guess she did think that it was a joke. And I mean, if she really truly was brainwashed by this man, he probably said even worse things that she didn't think twice about, because he was worshiping her and treating her like a queen. So she was probably just stuck in this world of he's not a bad guy, he's a good guy. But anyway, Shad had decided to talk to Debra's daughters about it, Tara and Veronica. And he had asked them about, what do you think of this guy? I don't feel comfortable about this guy. I don't feel comfortable being around him. And her daughters had said that they had already hired a private investigator and that they found some information about John. So there were some things that they left out, but there were also some things that Shad would end up telling Debra. The thing that they left out was that there were addresses that they found in his name, one of which was a prison. So they didn't want to tell her that. They wanted to look more into that. What Shad would end up telling Debra was that John had served time in prison and had lied about being an anesthesiologist. He had also filed for bankruptcy, and he had multiple different addresses in his name throughout the entire country, including one that was in a trailer park in California. So she didn't really sound concerned when she talked to Shad. She didn't really think anything of it. However, she did end up calling the phone number that they had for the trailer, and a woman answered, and the woman said that she had a relationship with John and that she hadn't heard from John in quite a while and that he just disappeared one day. So she would end up telling John about this whole situation, and John was obviously pissed. He contacted Shad and said that Shad needs to keep his distance, that he doesn't want to hear from him, and that if he tried to come to the house or if he tried to get in contact with Debra, he would call the police. He threatened him with violence, and so obviously Shad decided to keep his distance. What he would end up saying at one point is that Shad had already lost his mom, and because he thought of Debra as almost like his second mom, he didn't want to lose another one. So that was something that I think Debra really took to heart, because she didn't take her sister's death very easily. She was very close with Cindy. So that's something to think about too. But in March of 2015, there was a letter that came in the mail, and it was addressed to John. Debra didn't think anything of it. She opened it because, they're married, so she didn't think he'd get pissed off about it, because if you don't have anything to hide, then why are you going to get upset about it? But before she could even get past the part where it said hi, John just came busting out, yelling at her, telling her that it's a felony to open someone else's mail, and it was almost as if he was already spying on her, that he was watching her, and that he saw that she found this letter that was addressed to him, and it was weird. So she thought that was a little odd, but she decided to start looking through John's papers that he had, his documents, and she didn't confront him about it. She decided to keep it to herself. What she found was evidence of a long history of seducing, conning, and harassing women, and that he had lost his license due to a drug problem. By the time that John and Debra had married in December of 2014, John had 3 separate women around the Southern California area who had standing restraining orders with him, and 3 other ones who were waiting to get or requested to get a restraining order. Debra would also find printouts of these just bunches of pages of women that were saying bad things about him, about how he's a dangerous man. One would say, "Do not let this man into your life." Someone else said he's a con artist, and another person even said classic psychopath. So that was also the time where Debra would find out why he had the name Dirty John, and how it was for the brief time that he was in law school. A former classmate would end up saying that John was basically this strange lone wolf guy that did all kinds of scandalous things, and it wasn't just with women. Another classmate would go on to say, "That guy, you can't trust him for nothing. He's rotten top to bottom." So at this point, Debra was really, really nervous, and she was really freaking out. So she called her therapist to get a refill for her anxiety medication. She also called her lawyer at the same time because she was worried. Her lawyer advised her to take him off the will immediately, and so she did just that. Debra decided to keep all of this information to herself and not tell John about it. She was trying to be very, very careful about it and just making sure that she had all of her bases covered and that she was going to be able to get out of this safely. But after she found all of this, she decided to move out of their Balboa Island home. And the good thing about this is that at this point in time, John had admitted himself into the hospital. This was a very normal thing for him to do when he would run out of medication. He would check himself into a hospital for something about his back, and then he would get all of the pain medication that he was needing. So in my personal opinion, I think he was just going to the hospital to get his fix, I guess you can say. And during this time, Debra decided this was the perfect time to pack up and leave. While her family was helping her move out, they found some more very suspicious paperwork that John had. It had a bunch of numbers on it, and it looked like some of them were codes for guns. Other ones were codes for banking information, phone numbers, names, that kind of a thing. Obviously, that's really weird, and why would you have all of that kind of information? But after Debra tells John that she's leaving him, he threatens her and he says, "You better give me half of your money because I'm entitled to that half of the money." He would go on to say that he even had family members that were in the mob and that they would come after Debra, which is, that's a bit extreme for a guy who is supposed to be this great all-around guy who isn't a threat, but he was. Debra would go on to talk to an investigator who advised her to change her look. They said either dye your hair or get a wig, make sure that you wear different clothes, don't wear flashy clothes, make sure that you wear very simple clothes, and if we want you to be living in hotels, make sure to move from hotel to hotel every couple days. We'll teach you how to look at a room to make sure that nobody's in the room and that you're safe. And that wasn't the end of it, because this is where I'm going to say don't pass judgment, because if you do, you are going to victim blame with this next portion. She was in a toxic relationship, and I just want you guys to remember that before you pass any kind of judgment. Please don't victim blame. I have to say that multiple times, but Debra and John would end up getting back together. He would beg her to take him back. He would say he didn't want to tell her about his previous life with all the conning because she would never want to be with him, and that he loved her. He's only doing all of this because of the drugs that he was on, and that he's asking her, "Can you help me get clean? I want to get clean and I want to be this perfect guy for you." So of course, she decided she'll take him back. And if you listen to the Dirty John podcast, she actually said he always had a story. He told me that he had lied because he thought he'd lose me, that he feels so lucky that I'm such a forgiving person. I'm the love of his life, that I've made him a better person. They would end up moving into an apartment in Irvine, California. And obviously because of this, Debra's family kept their distance away from the two of them. And then in March of 2016, after about a year and 3 months that they were married, Debra was still suspicious, and she was starting to get a little more uncomfortable around John. And of course, the tension between him and her daughters was just getting worse and worse by the day. John did not want Debra seeing her children. He would threaten her about it, and there was one time where he caught her sneaking out and meeting up with Veronica. He had ended up telling her that if he catches her again, and if he catches her talking to Veronica, because he was pissed off that she was paying for Veronica's real estate license, schooling and stuff like that, because obviously he wants all of her money. But he ended up telling her that if she sees her again, or if she talks to her again, he's going to throw Veronica in the ocean, which is kind of extreme if you ask me. That would have been the moment where I would have just flipped out if that was one of my kids. I would have literally, I can't even imagine what was going through Debra's mind at that point, because I think she was so terrified that she had to keep her cool in order to be able to get out of this relationship safely, so that she wouldn't end up in a dumpster somewhere. You know what I mean? And I know that that sounds horrible, but I really truly think that she was terrified. But what she would end up doing after that was she finally had enough. She had enough of this. She had enough of John, and she kind of like snapped out of it. Well, in March, she filed to have her marriage annulled in April. And just like I just said, my assumption of her wanting to get out of the relationship safely, because of that, she decided that she was going to start taking money out of her bank account. And she was starting to take this cash out as a just in case so that he couldn't take her money. Well, John ended up finding out that she was taking money out of the account, and he found the cash that she was stashing in her closet. Well, he confronted her about it, and he said, "What's this?" And she said, "Well, that's my money. Like, what's the problem here? That's my money. It's not your money." And he would end up going on to say, "What's yours is mine." So he obviously was pissed off, and she ended up getting out of there really, really fast. She was scared, and she took just her makeup, a little bit of clothing, and just got out of there before he could actually hurt her, because he ended up threatening her, and he said to her, "What are you going to do? Like, hit me or whatever? Because if you hit me, you're going to be really sorry." So, I mean, I would be terrified in that situation too. After all of this happened, Debra would end up moving in with Veronica, and John would move to Nevada, and he would live in one of Debra's homes out in Nevada. And the reason why she moved in with her daughter is because the complex that her daughter lived in it had cameras everywhere, it had security everywhere, so they felt safe. Debra would end up requesting a restraining order against John. However, an Orange County judge denied the request. He said that it didn't seem like there was any threat from John, and that he never physically harmed Debra, so he didn't see why she needed a restraining order. And on June 11th of 2016, after Debra had tried getting this restraining order, John came to her office and stole her Jaguar right out of her parking spot in the parking lot. They had surveillance footage of this, and police never pressed any charges. He had tried to light the car on fire, however, he was unsuccessful because there was only minor damage to the car. It was just mild fire damage. He was planning on just the whole thing going up, but it didn't. Let's move on to the serious portion where it could have ended very badly. So this is where we're going to talk about the attack on Tara. On August 20th of 2016 is where it turns into a dangerous situation. Debra's daughter, Veronica, had called Tara to warn her that John was back in town, and that she had witnessed him outside of her apartment, outside of Veronica's apartment. She saw John just kind of hanging out there, so he obviously found them. So Veronica had called Tara to let her know, "Be careful, he's back in town." Well, after that whole incident and them talking, when Tara would return home from work that day, she was parked in her parking lot outside of her Newport Beach apartment building. As she was getting out of the car, John had attacked her with a knife, and he was trying to push her back into the car. But somehow, she was able to get out of the car, and she was able to fight back. Now, keep in mind that John was 6'2" at the time. He was still much, much bigger than Tara. So they were fighting, and he was attacking her. And Tara said that he was trying to push me into the car. I tried to get away from him. I was screaming, and he put his hand over my mouth, and I bit as hard as I could. Tara has said in interviews that she watched a lot of The Walking Dead, so in her mind, she was just kind of, I guess you can say maybe she was reenacting what was happening, and she was just trying to save herself. She knew that it was either him or her, that if she didn't kill him, he was going to kill her. And she had these really heavy rain boots on that day that had a really thick tread on them. So she was able to somehow kick the knife out of John's hand, and somehow was able to get the knife. What she ended up doing next was she stabbed him 13 times. One of the times was right into the eye, and it went into his brain. But he wasn't dead. When paramedics arrived on the scene, they were able to revive him, and he had a pulse. But Tara had called Debra, her mom, and said, "I'm really, really sorry. I think I just killed your husband." So when police arrived on the scene, they were looking through John's car and they saw that he had a lot of items in there that included duct tape, wires, his passport, and a bunch of other things that looked as though he was trying to take Tara hostage and possibly take her out of the country. So it was good that Tara reacted the way that she did. Now, because John didn't die at the scene, he was in a coma, and then on August 24th of 2016, his sister Karen had come to the hospital and she decided to pull the plug. They decided that because he was on life support, they decided that he's not coming back from this. And for him, that was the last time that anybody saw him, because his body was cremated and there was no memorial. So no one cared that he had left this earth. And that's just the crazy part to me, is that nobody cared enough. Not even his own family cared enough. But Debra would go on to tell Fox 5 about her experience with Dirty John, and this inspired her to try and help victims of toxic relationships and domestic abuse and domestic violence. And she would go on to say that there are women that are probably scared to death to leave. They don't see any other way of getting out of the relationship, and I want to have a voice for them. So I found it interesting that she was able to do something after a situation like this. I've seen interviews and it seems like they're doing pretty okay, but Tara is suffering from PTSD, and she's working with a therapist to not necessarily get over it, but be able to deal with what happened and everything of that nature. But first and foremost, I just want to say my final thoughts on this whole thing is be careful and be safe, because everything that we do now usually is through the internet. It's usually through the technology that we have at our fingertips. And I mean, I've been on dating sites before. Before I met my fiance, I was on dating sites, but I was really, really careful with, if I was meeting somebody, it had to be in a public place. I had to make sure that I parked right next to the building, or I parked somewhere where there's a lot of traffic, and I wouldn't go anywhere with them by myself. It was just, and I would tell my friends and family, hey, I'm going to this place, this is where I am. If I don't call you in a certain amount of time, come looking for me. But I'm sure that a lot of people passed on judgment to Debra because she had such a monster living with her and she didn't take her children's word for it. But you have to remember that she was a victim. She was brainwashed by this man, and she really truly thought that he was a great guy, and the fact that he had an explanation for everything, and she eventually snapped out of it. But I mean, that's a scary situation. And just remember that she was a victim, or is a victim of this. And I feel as though until you're in a toxic relationship, or until you're in a relationship with when there is domestic abuse, you don't understand, because a lot of people will say, well, why didn't you just leave? Some women are terrified for their lives and their children's lives to be able to leave, because most of the time, well, not most of the time, but sometimes it doesn't end the way that this case ended. Sometimes the man will go after the woman and her kids, and it's just one of those things where I just want people to think about it and just be safe and really pay attention to red flags. And I guess that's all of what I have for my final thoughts on this case. And I mean, I hope that Debra and her kids and her nephew are able to one day be able to live. I mean, they're kind of living a normal life, but how do you come back from something like that? So I truly hope that they're all okay, and I truly hope that they, especially Tara, I hope that she works through all of this with her therapist. And like I said, the one daughter, the one that I keep calling Veronica, she does want to be kept out of it. She does want to be kept anonymous. That's why they changed her name in the Bravo series. So that's why I changed her name in this as well, just out of respect for her. But anyway, if you have watched up to here, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to hit like, subscribe, check me out on my social media, and I'll see you guys next time. This is Monica reporting to you live from a highway. Bye.